Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back, far back. To the banks of the Nile. To the sound of water lapping softly against reed boats, the air heavy with incense, and the faint rustle of silk as someone plots someone else's downfall again. Because tonight, we're visiting ancient Egypt. Specifically, the royal house of the Ptolemies. A family so spectacularly dysfunctional that modern soap operas look like kindergarten tea parties by comparison. So go ahead, dim the lights, settle in, and let's drift into a world where everyone has the same 5 names, all the siblings marry each other, and every family dinner might end in poison. The setup: a Greek family in Egypt. Let's start with the basics. The Ptolemies weren't Egyptian. They were Greek, descendants of Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who carved out Egypt for himself after Alexander's death. And because he liked shiny things, Ptolemy decided to crown himself pharaoh. Which was bold, considering he didn't speak Egyptian. But, as history proves time and again, details are for peasants. The dynasty would last almost 300 years. 3 centuries of sibling marriages, assassinations, and the kind of political maneuvering that could make even Machiavelli sigh, "Oh, come on." By the time we reach Cleopatra VII, the Cleopatra, this royal family tree looks less like a tree and more like a tangle of snakes politely strangling one another. The family she was born into. Cleopatra was born around 69 BCE, to a world of gold, politics, and paranoia. Her father, Ptolemy XII, known to his critics as Auletes, or the flute player, earned that nickname not for his musical talent, but because he spent most of his reign playing, literally, the flute, while Rome quietly took over Egypt. He wasn't exactly respected. Imagine a king whose subjects riot when he returns from exile. That was Ptolemy XII. He had the unfortunate habit of paying off Roman politicians for support, which, as you might guess, left the treasury emptier than a tourist's wallet after visiting the pyramids. Cleopatra's mother might have been Cleopatra VII, possibly her father's sister, or niece, or, well, family relationships in the Ptolemaic dynasty were like spaghetti, twisty, unclear, and best not examined too closely. Still, Cleopatra grew up in Alexandria, surrounded by marble palaces, scrolls from every corner of the known world, and a family so treacherous that trusting anyone was considered a rookie mistake. Royal education, Egyptian style, sort of. Cleopatra, unlike her father, actually learned Egyptian. In fact, she may have been the first of her dynasty to do so in generations. That alone made her stand out, an actual pharaoh who could talk to her subjects without needing an interpreter. She was educated in philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, rhetoric, all the classic Greek arts, and probably trained in the subtler skills of survival, like knowing when someone was trying to poison your figs. From a young age, she understood that Egypt's power didn't really belong to Egypt anymore. It belonged to Rome. And every decision she made would be shadowed by that inconvenient fact. Enter the sibling rivalry of doom. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra, at about 18, inherited the throne, jointly, with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. Joint rule. Because that always works out. They were also married, of course, because the Ptolemies loved efficiency. One ceremony could cover both monarchy and matrimony. At first, Cleopatra ruled in her own name, leaving her brother mostly in the background, possibly doing 10-year-old things like throwing papyrus darts at servants. But soon, factions formed. Her brother's advisors whispered that she was too independent, too powerful, too queenly. Which, you know, are terrible qualities in a monarch. Within a few years, Cleopatra was exiled from her own palace, fleeing to Syria. Her brother's side claimed the throne. Cleopatra began plotting her return. And that's when a very famous Roman general inconveniently showed up. Enter Julius Caesar, the unexpected houseguest. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt chasing his rival, Pompey the Great, who had fled there after losing a civil war. Pompey, unfortunately, was immediately murdered by Ptolemy XII's court as a gift to Caesar. Which was not the gift Caesar wanted. So there he was, in a strange land, annoyed, and suddenly in the middle of a dynastic squabble between two teenage monarchs. Cleopatra, exiled and opportunistic, saw her chance. Now, the story goes that she famously smuggled herself into the royal palace rolled up in a carpet, or, as more practical historians suggest, in a linen sack, to meet Caesar privately. Either way, it was bold, theatrical, and exactly her style. When the carpet unfurled, or the sack untied, out stepped Cleopatra, radiant, confident, and apparently persuasive enough to win the support of Rome's most powerful man. Caesar sided with her. And just like that, her brother was out. Family fallout, Egyptian edition. Ptolemy XIII, naturally, was not thrilled. He tried to fight back, raising an army. Caesar and Cleopatra were besieged in the palace for months. The conflict ended with Ptolemy XII's army defeated, and the young king drowning in the Nile while trying to flee. It's almost poetic. Except that the Nile didn't notice. With her brother gone, Cleopatra installed another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, as co-ruler. Because some traditions die hard. But everyone knew who was really in charge. She and Caesar became lovers, and soon she gave birth to a son, Caesarion, or Little Caesar. Yes, that was his actual name. Which would be adorable if it weren't attached to centuries of imperial ambition. Cleopatra in Rome. A few years later, Cleopatra visited Rome with her son. She stayed in Caesar's villa, very publicly, and scandalized polite society. Roman senators were not thrilled to see their dictator entertaining an Egyptian queen who called herself the new Isis. Still, Caesar had a golden statue of her placed in the temple of Venus Genetrix. Subtle, it was not. Then came 44 BCE. The Ides of March. Caesar was assassinated, and Cleopatra's careful plans collapsed overnight. She quietly slipped out of Rome and returned to Egypt, where her brother husband Ptolemy XIV died soon after, possibly of poisoning. Possibly by her hand. Because of course. She made her son, Caesarion, her co-ruler. And once again, Cleopatra stood alone at the top. The second Roman problem, Mark Antony. But Rome wasn't done with Egypt. After Caesar's death, his former allies divided the Roman world between them. In the eastern half, Egypt's neighborhood, fell to Mark Antony. When Antony summoned Cleopatra to explain her loyalty to Caesar's memory, she didn't show up meekly. She arrived in a golden barge, under silken sails, surrounded by musicians, attendants, and perfumes so strong they reached the shore before she did. Antony was enchanted. And Cleopatra, who had learned exactly how to handle Roman egos, knew it. Their partnership was romantic, political, and expensive. Together they held lavish feasts that made even Roman chroniclers clutch their pearls. Gold plates. Rare wines. An entire night's meal dissolved in vinegar just to show it could be done. And together, they had 3 children. The downfall, Octavian's patience runs out. Back in Rome, not everyone appreciated this Mediterranean soap opera. Octavian, later Augustus, was Caesar's heir and Antony's rival. To him, Cleopatra wasn't a queen, she was a dangerous foreign temptress corrupting a Roman general. Propaganda flew. Octavian painted Cleopatra as an Eastern seductress bent on enslaving Rome. Antony, he claimed, had lost himself in Egyptian luxury. And Rome, famously, hated luxury almost as much as it loved it. War followed. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Cleopatra and Antony's fleet was decisively defeated. They fled back to Egypt, pursued by Octavian's forces. The end was inevitable. Antony, believing Cleopatra dead, fell on his sword. Cleopatra, upon hearing of his death and knowing Octavian intended to parade her through Rome, took her own life. The story says she used an asp, symbol of Egyptian royalty. But more likely, it was poison concealed in a comb or ointment. Either way, it was quiet. Calculated. Dignified. And the end of 300 years of Ptolemaic rule. The legacy, gold, marble, and memory. Octavian annexed Egypt as his personal province. Caesar Ion, Cleopatra's son, was executed on Octavian's orders. Rome could not risk another Caesar. But Cleopatra's legend survived. To the Romans, she was both villain and enchantress. To later centuries, she became a symbol of beauty, intelligence, and tragic ambition. In reality, she was a survivor, born into chaos, navigating empire through wit, charm, and cold calculation. A woman who ruled a dying kingdom and made it unforgettable. Let's drift gently out of Alexandria now. The waves of the Mediterranean are still. The marble palaces are quiet. And Cleopatra's story, as loud and glittering as it once was, fades into the hush of history. But don't worry, we're not done. Because in the next royal disaster, we're heading north, to medieval Europe, where family dysfunction reached whole new levels of genetic enthusiasm. Welcome back. Still comfortable? Good. Let's drift together into the candlelit corridors of medieval Europe, where marriage wasn't about love, or even mild affection. It was about treaties, borders, and making sure your cousin didn't invade your farm. And so, for centuries, royal families did what they thought was perfectly logical. They kept marrying each other. Over and over. Generation after generation. Because, as they reasoned, who could possibly be more trustworthy than family? Unfortunately, biology had a few objections. The Habsburgs, when the family tree forgot to branch. Let's start with the Habsburgs. Because really, how could we not? This was a dynasty so dedicated to marrying their own cousins that you could almost hear the sound of genetics begging for mercy. At its height, the Habsburg Empire spanned much of Europe, Austria, Spain, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and more. They were immensely powerful. And, as it turns out, immensely inbred. Their motto was "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." Which sounded poetic. Until you looked at their family portraits. The most famous jaw in Europe. Let's meet one of the more unfortunate products of all this marital recycling, Charles II of Spain. Born in 1661, Charles was the end of a very long, very tangled genetic line. By his generation, the Habsburgs had been marrying cousins, uncles, and nieces for more than 2 centuries. And it showed. He was often described as frail, sickly, and, how to put this politely, structurally challenged. His jaw, famously, was so large and misaligned that he couldn't chew properly. His tongue was too big for his mouth, which made speaking difficult. And his head, well, it was said to be too big for his body. He was nicknamed El Hechizado, the Bewitched, because people couldn't explain his condition without assuming dark magic was involved. Modern geneticists, however, have crunched the numbers. Charles had an inbreeding coefficient of over 25%, roughly the same as if your parents were brother and sister. So, yes. No witchcraft required. Charles II's reign of waiting. Charles became king at 4 years old. Which sounds adorable, until you realize he would remain functionally childlike for most of his life. He was reportedly gentle and kind, but mentally slow, physically weak, and constantly ill. His court revolved around managing his health, his tantrums, and, most urgently, his fertility. For years, Spain prayed for an heir. Charles married twice. Both wives wrote home saying, things were not working. At all. Doctors examined him. Priests prayed over him. One doctor reportedly declared that his body contained no blood, only water. Which, if true, would certainly explain a lot. He died childless at 38. With him, the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs ended. And Europe plunged into the War of the Spanish Succession. All because no one thought it might be a good idea to marry someone not related. The Habsburg chin, an inherited disaster. To be fair, the signs had been there for generations. You can trace the evolution of the Habsburg chin through centuries of portraiture. By the 1600s, their lower jaws could probably have been used as architectural supports. Scientists studying the so-called Habsburg jaw have found a strong correlation between the family's level of inbreeding and the severity of the deformity. which is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The irony is that these marriages were supposed to strengthen the dynasty, to unite empires. Instead, they slowly broke the family from within. But they weren't alone. The Habsburgs may have set the standard for genetic calamity, but they were hardly alone in their enthusiasm for keeping things in the family. Let's drift gently north to medieval England. Because if there's one thing English monarchs were good at, it was marrying for politics and regretting it later. The Plantagenets, too much drama, not enough distance. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the Plantagenets had mastered the art of the political marriage. Henry II married Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in Europe. Which sounds romantic, until you remember she had previously been married to the King of France. Their union produced a litter of royal children who spent most of their adult lives rebelling against one or both parents. Family dinners must have been tense. Richard the Lionheart, one of their sons, became a crusading hero and possibly the least interested husband in royal history. He was married to Berengaria of Navarre, who never once set foot in England during his reign. They may never have consummated the marriage at all. But don't worry, his brother John made up for it with enthusiasm and questionable judgment. The Lancasters and Yorks, cousins, crowns, and chaos. A few centuries later, England descended into the Wars of the Roses, a long, exhausting family argument over who got to wear the crown. Both sides were descended from Edward III, which meant, yes, more cousin marriages. And a whole lot of slightly overlapping bloodlines. When Henry VII finally ended the wars by marrying Elizabeth of York, he was technically uniting two halves of the same extended family. It worked politically. Genetically? Less so. But by then, Europe was used to a little overlap. The Tudors, a smaller family, same problems. Ah yes, the Tudors. Henry VIII, in particular, took marital misfortune to new levels. Now, his problems weren't genetic, at least not in the same sense. But his obsession with producing a male heir led him to marry 6 times, behead 2 wives, and destabilize England for generations. Ironically, his one legitimate surviving child, Elizabeth I, ruled magnificently and chose never to marry. Which was, in retrospect, one of the healthiest genetic decisions any Tudor ever made. Let's drift east, the Romanovs' tragic legacy. We'll leave England's palaces now and drift quietly east, to the cold glitter of Imperial Russia, where the Romanovs ruled with opulent grandeur, and where another royal marriage would go very wrong. In 1894, Tsar Nicholas II married Alexandria of Hesse, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Which already meant their bloodlines were rather interwoven. The result? A son, Alexei, born with hemophilia, a genetic blood disorder passed down through Queen Victoria's descendants. Alexei's condition was devastating. Any small injury could cause severe internal bleeding. The royal family kept his illness secret, but the anxiety haunted them constantly. Enter Rasputin, the wandering mystic who claimed to heal the boy through prayer and hypnotic suggestion. He didn't cure hemophilia, of course, but Alexandra believed he could. Which gave him enormous influence over the royal family. That influence helped erode public trust. And when revolution came, the Romanovs' fate was sealed. All from a single inherited gene, passed quietly from queen to grandson, across empires. Queen Victoria, the grandmother of Europe. It's worth pausing on Victoria herself. She and Prince Albert were first cousins, perfectly acceptable at the time, and common among royals. Their 9 children married into nearly every major European house, spreading her genes, and her hemophilia, across the continent. By the early 20th century, her descendants sat on the thrones of Britain, Germany, Russia, Norway, Sweden, and Spain. It was called the family business. Unfortunately, family business also meant family health issues. And by the time World War I broke out, the kings of Britain, Germany, and Russia, first cousins, were on opposite sides of the battlefield. So, in the end, all that cousin marrying didn't even prevent wars. It just made them awkwardly personal. Genetic irony, royal addition. What's remarkable is that so much of this was intentional. Royal advisors knew that intermarriage could lead to problems. But dynastic pride often outweighed medical caution. They saw blood purity as strength, even as it quietly weakened their own lines. In the modern world, we tend to think of these families as glittering, powerful, untouchable. But behind the jewels and portraits were real people, often sick, often infertile, and often miserable. All trapped by the same logic that built their empires. The end of the bloodlines. By the 20th century, the royal gene pool had finally started to widen. Science caught up. And even monarchs realized that marrying outside one's immediate family was probably a good idea. Today, surviving royal families of Europe are far more genetically diverse and far less politically powerful. Which, in its own way, might be the happiest ending they could hope for. Let's drift out now, leaving behind the candlelit halls and the portraits with too many chins. The royal bloodlines fade quietly into the past, like old perfume. The palaces stand, but the dynasties that filled them have dissolved into legend and museum plaques. And as the night deepens, we can leave the glittering sorrow of Europe's royal families behind. Because next, we'll be visiting a gentler, stranger topic. Hey again. You've made it through Cleopatra's palace and Europe's genetic labyrinth. Now let's rest a little deeper, somewhere in the echoing corridors of medieval castles, where tiny monarchs grew up surrounded by velvet, incense, and the faint smell of damp stone. Because while royal childhoods might look glamorous in paintings, gold cradles, jewel-studded toys, and nurses in silks, the reality was usually lonelier, colder, and occasionally fatal. After all, being royal meant being valuable. And valuable things were rarely treated like children. The royal cradle, born into ceremony, not family. From the moment a royal baby took its first breath, its life belonged not to its parents, but to the court. Births were public events. Dozens of witnesses watched the queen give birth, just to confirm the baby was legitimate and not swapped for someone sturdier halfway through. The infant was swaddled, inspected, and promptly handed off to a nurse. The queen might see it occasionally, like a guest visiting a rare exhibit. Royal mothers were expected to keep producing heirs, not raise them. Nannies, tutors, priests, and physicians did the actual work. And since most of them were politically aligned with someone or other, every nursery was already a miniature court, complete with factions and whispered schemes. Imagine growing up knowing half the adults around you would rather see your cousin on the throne. The perils of being born important. Infant mortality was high everywhere, but among royals it carried extra consequences. Every cradle death shifted alliances, succession lines, and sometimes entire wars. So when royal children fell ill, and they often did, it was never just a family tragedy. It was a national crisis. Physicians prescribed the finest nonsense money could buy, powdered pearls, pigeon hearts, and occasionally, a blessed eel. If that didn't work, the child was simply said to be visited by God's will. Few made it to adulthood unscarred. Fever, smallpox, or dysentery took many before they could even learn to walk. And for those who survived, the real hardships were only beginning. Tutored in terror. Education for royal children was rigorous, and often miserable. Boys were trained to rule, Latin, scripture, swordsmanship, and the art of pretending to care about the clergy. Girls were taught obedience, music, and the delicate balancing act of existing without upsetting anyone important. Beatings were considered character building. Affection, on the other hand, was considered suspiciously French. Tutors were terrifying men in black robes who believed love softened the will. So they didn't bother with it. Henry VIII, as a boy, was praised for his intellect but warned against too much pleasure. He took that advice, not at all. Mary, Queen of Scots, was groomed from infancy to be a diplomatic pawn. She was sent to France at 5, married off in her teens, and by her early 20s was already a widow, queen, and political target. A lifetime of duty, planned before she could read. The sickly ones. And then there were the children who simply weren't built for the life expected of them. Take Edward VI, son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. He was the long-awaited male heir, England's precious future. Unfortunately, he was also a fragile, coughing child who spent most of his short life indoors, under layers of fur and anxiety. Every sneeze sent the court into panic. Every cough sparked rumors. He died at 15, likely of tuberculosis, after ruling for just 6 years. And the succession crisis that followed nearly tore England apart again. A delicate balance, the spoiled and the scared. Some royal children survived only to become unbearable adults. Which makes sense, when you think about it. If you're told from birth that you're chosen by God, that everyone you meet exists to serve you, and that you must never admit fault, humility is not likely to be your strong suit. Louis XIV of France, for example, was told he was the Sun King. That the world revolved around him. By age 10, he believed it. By 20, he expected everyone else to believe it too. He became one of the most powerful monarchs in European history, and one of its loneliest. His childhood had taught him that love and obedience were the same thing. Which is, as therapists might say, a problem. The lonely little king, Richard II. In England, Richard II had a similar problem. Crowned at just 10 years old, he spent his youth surrounded by flatterers, tutors, and ambitious nobles. He grew up vain, sensitive, and utterly convinced that he was special, because everyone told him so. As an adult, he became increasingly paranoid and unstable, alternating between poetic melancholy and political cruelty. Eventually, his cousin deposed him. Richard was imprisoned and quietly starved to death. It's hard not to wonder what might have happened if he'd just had a normal childhood, one where someone told him no. The tragedy of the Tower, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. And of course, we can't talk about royal children without mentioning the princes in the Tower. In 1483, Edward V, aged 12, and his younger brother Richard were taken to the Tower of London by their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. He claimed he was protecting them. Then he declared them illegitimate. Then he crowned himself King Richard III. The princes were never seen again. To this day, no one knows for certain what happened. But their disappearance became a symbol of royal fragility, a reminder that even being born to power didn't make you safe from it. Royal daughters, pretty, patient, and expendable. If royal sons carried the burden of inheritance, royal daughters bore the burden of diplomacy. From birth, they were bargaining chips, betrothed, traded, and shipped off to strangers for the sake of peace. Many were married before puberty, their signatures affixed to treaties they couldn't read. Isabella of Valois, married to Richard II at 6 years old, was one of them. She was sent to England to unite France and England in peace. Instead, she spent her childhood in a foreign court, widowed by 11, and sent back home with a dowry and some trauma. Even queens like Catherine of Aragon began life this way, married off as teenagers, used as political glue between nations, and blamed when their bodies failed to produce the right kind of heir. Fragile thrones and fragile bodies. The irony of royal childhoods was that the higher your birth, the less control you had over your own life. Commoners could at least choose, within limits, their path, apprenticeships, marriages, a little corner of the world to call their own. Royal children, meanwhile, were treated like chess pieces made of porcelain. Too precious to touch, too fragile to survive the game. They were overfed, overclothed, underloved, and constantly examined for signs of divine favor. A twitch was an omen. A fever, a political event. A smile, if noticed, was probably filed away in someone's diplomatic report. When childhood ends early. And for many, childhood didn't last long at all. In medieval times, as soon as a royal boy could lift a small sword, or a royal girl could stand quietly in a gown, they were considered adults. Henry VI of England was crowned at 9 months old. By the time he could talk, he was already treated as a statesman. Which might explain why, later in life, he had several mental breakdowns and preferred praying to governing. When your earliest memories involve being dressed in ermine and told you're God's chosen, the pressure does tend to build. The bright spots, there were a few. Not every royal childhood was miserable. Some had rare pockets of warmth. Elizabeth I, for example, after her father's rather dramatic marital history, grew up under uncertain conditions, but found refuge in her education. She loved languages, music, and philosophy. Her tutors adored her intellect, if not her gender. By adulthood, she could read and write in 6 languages and understood the art of survival better than anyone alive. Even Louis IX of France, later canonized as a saint, had a deeply religious mother who loved him fiercely. Her advice? Prefer death to sin. Which might be overdoing it a little, but at least she meant well. A quiet reflection. When we look at portraits of royal children, painted with solemn faces and embroidered gowns, it's easy to forget they were real. They giggled. They sulked. They clung to nurses and feared the dark. And most of them didn't get to grow up before the world decided what they would be. In the end, their stories remind us that privilege and happiness rarely coincide. Gold can buy comfort, but not care. And palaces, for all their grandeur, were never designed to raise children. Only heirs. So, as the last candle flickers out, we'll leave the royal nurseries behind. The echoes fade, tiny footsteps down marble halls, the rustle of silk in the dark. The world outside those walls goes on. Empires rise and fall. Bloodlines twist and thin. And the children who once carried crowns become part of the soft, endless hum of history. Hey everyone! Still awake? If not, that's perfectly fine. This is a safe place for gentle absurdity. Because now, we're gliding into that peculiar corner of royal history where divine right meets human nonsense, where kings and queens, entrusted with entire nations, used that power to settle personal vendettas, argue about curtains, or just be dramatic. In other words, the moments that remind us royalty were, above all else, human. Deeply flawed. Occasionally brilliant. And often catastrophically petty. Charles VI of France, the one who thought he was made of glass. Let's begin softly, in late medieval France. With Charles VI, a man who technically ruled an empire but, for much of his reign, believed he was made entirely of glass. He was crowned in 1380, at only 11 years old, with all the usual pomp and chanting. At first, things went well. He was called Charles the Beloved. But then, something shifted. He suffered a mental breakdown in his 20s, possibly from schizophrenia or untreated bipolar disorder. After that, reality became somewhat optional. He refused to let people touch him. He ordered iron rods sewn into his clothing to protect his fragile glass bones. He would sit motionless for hours, terrified of shattering. His court, unsure what to do, went along with it, tiptoeing, bowing deeply, and pretending nothing was amiss. When your monarch thinks he's a chandelier, you learn to adapt. The French royal family, dysfunction as a lifestyle. Charles's wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, handled his episodes as best she could. But court life quickly descended into chaos. Rival factions vied for control, claiming the right to rule in his name. His brother Louis of Orleans and his cousin the Duke of Burgundy even took their feud to open warfare. Meanwhile, Charles's children grew up in an atmosphere of fear, instability, and constant conspiracy. By the time he died, France was divided, England had invaded, and his daughter Catherine was being married off to Henry V of England in an attempt to salvage peace. And so, one man's glass delusion helped pave the way for the 100 Years' War's most disastrous chapters. It's a good reminder, sometimes the greatest historical catastrophes begin with one very bad family dynamic. Ivan the Terrible, the name says it all. Let's float east for a moment, into 16th century Russia. Where Ivan IV, known fondly, or not, as Ivan the Terrible, ruled with volcanic moods and catastrophic temper. Ivan began life as an orphan prince, watching the boyars, the noble class, poison, beat, and manipulate one another for power. By age 8, he was already torturing animals and throwing live cats from castle walls. So, naturally, he became Tsar. At first, he governed energetically, reforming laws and expanding territory. But paranoia crept in. He began to see betrayal everywhere. He established the Oprichnina, a secret police force allowed to kill anyone they suspected of disloyalty. Entire towns were massacred on his whim. And then came the most infamous episode. In a fit of rage, Ivan struck his eldest son with a staff, killing him. The heir to the throne, gone, just like that. When Ivan realized what he'd done, he broke down, weeping and beating his head against the floor. The image is haunting. A man who ruled through fear, finally destroyed by it. And yet, he remains one of Russia's most mythologized figures, half monster, half tragic soul. Peter the Great, westernization by force, and razor. While we're in Russia, let's drift forward a century to Peter the Great, the man who dragged Russia into modernity, kicking and screaming. Peter was a reformer, yes. But also a man with the emotional maturity of a particularly irritable teenager. He built a new capital, St. Petersburg, carved out of swamp and frost. He modernized the army, navy, and government. And he personally enjoyed sailing, engineering, and dentistry. Which is less charming when you learn that his idea of a good time was extracting teeth from terrified courtiers, often uninvited. Peter also hated traditional Russian beards, seeing them as backward. So he imposed a beard tax. Men who wanted to keep their beards had to pay for the privilege, and carry a little metal token proving they'd done so. Imagine a monarch so committed to progress that he personally shaves his nobles, in public, to make a point. It's the kind of leadership style that really gets people talking. Louis XIV, the original control freak. Back in France, Louis XIV perfected the art of ruling through vanity. He believed himself to be chosen by God, and also possibly God-adjacent. He built Versailles, a palace so enormous that guests routinely got lost in it, and perhaps that was the point. Louis controlled everything, down to how his courtiers folded their napkins. He created an entire ritual around getting dressed. At his lever, or morning rising ceremony, dozens of nobles would gather just to watch him put on socks. Each had a ranked position determining who was allowed to hand him which garment. He weaponized etiquette. By keeping the nobility obsessed with who could hand him a glove, he ensured none of them had the time or energy to plot rebellion. It was genius. And utterly ridiculous. The man turned dressing himself into a national security strategy. Queen Christina of Sweden, the queen who quit. Now let's glide north to Sweden in the 1600s. Queen Christina ascended the throne at age 6 after her father died in battle. Raised as a boy, educated like a prince, and entirely disinterested in marriage, she spent her youth baffling everyone around her. She was brilliant, fluent in multiple languages, fascinated by philosophy, art, and science. But she also refused to comb her hair, detested ceremony, and often wore men's clothing. Court gossip called her eccentric, which was royal speak for a handful. Eventually, she decided she'd had enough. In 1654, at the height of her power, she stunned Europe by abdicating the throne, converting to Catholicism, and moving to Rome. When asked why, she said she preferred books to politics. Which, honestly, is one of history's more relatable resignations. George III, the king who lost America, and sometimes his mind. Let's drift across the Channel, to Britain in the 18th century. King George III, often remembered as the Mad King who lost the colonies. In truth, he wasn't mad at all for most of his reign. He was dutiful, devout, and painfully earnest. Which made him deeply unpopular with his own aristocracy, who preferred monarchs who drank more and prayed less. But later in life, he suffered from a mysterious illness, now believed to be either porphyria or bipolar disorder. His symptoms included manic speech, sleeplessness, and long, rambling conversations with invisible companions. He would talk to trees. He would repeat the same words hundreds of times. And sometimes, he simply forgot who he was. During one episode, he reportedly shook hands with an oak tree, believing it to be the King of Prussia. Which is, not ideal foreign policy, but strangely wholesome. Despite everything, he remained a gentle soul, grieved more for his lost lucidity than for America. Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Dreamer King. Now, imagine a monarch born in the wrong century. That was Ludwig II of Bavaria. He loved music, architecture, and solitude. He adored Richard Wagner, whose operas he funded to extravagant excess. Instead of governing, Ludwig built castles, fantastical, dreamlike palaces scattered across Bavaria. The most famous, Neuschwanstein, looks like a fairy tale come to life. It was also ruinously expensive. His ministers grew frustrated. Eventually, they declared him insane and removed him from power. The next day, he was found dead in a lake beside his psychiatrist. No one knows what happened. Was he mad? Or simply too imaginative for his job description? Either way, he left behind castles so beautiful they'd later inspire Disneyland, proving that even dysfunction can leave something magical behind. The pettiest feud, Frederick the Great versus his father. If you've ever had a tense relationship with your parents, spare a thought for Frederick the Great of Prussia. Because his father once tried to execute him for liking flutes. Young Frederick adored music, poetry, and French philosophy. His father, Frederick William I, adored shouting and militarism. It was not a good match. At one point, Frederick tried to flee Prussia entirely. He was caught, imprisoned, and forced to watch his best friend executed in front of him. A touching father-son bonding moment. Eventually, Frederick inherited the throne and became one of Europe's most brilliant military leaders. But he never forgave his father. He built an empire, but never trusted love again. The petty, the petulant, and the plain weird. There are so many others. King James I of England, who personally wrote a book about witch hunting, then panicked when someone sneezed near him. Catherine the Great, who rebranded herself entirely after marrying into the Russian throne, then had her husband quietly deposed and possibly strangled. Christian VII of Denmark, who preferred playing with his dog to governing and once knighted the animal in a public ceremony. Royal dysfunction was a full-time occupation. And the more absolute their power, the more spectacular their mistakes became. Why we remember them? It's tempting to laugh at these stories, and we should, gently. But beneath the absurdity is something strangely human. Power magnifies everything. Petty jealousies become wars. Personal insecurities become state policy. One monarch's bad mood can shift the fate of nations. And yet, when we strip away the crowns and titles, these were just people, lonely, frightened, self-absorbed people trying, often poorly, to make sense of their own lives. They had the resources to indulge every impulse. And that, perhaps, was the real curse. Closing reflection. So, as we drift away from the marble halls and mirrored corridors of royal pettiness, let's leave them to their sleep. Charles, still fragile as glass. Ivan, raging in his palace. Louis, surrounded by courtiers in silence. Ludwig, dreaming in his castle by the lake. All of them, in the end, victims of their own reflections. And with that, we reach the final chapter of tonight's long and winding journey through royal chaos and melancholy. If you're still awake, and that would be impressive, our last stop is a gentle one. A soft, wistful ending to the night. Hey everyone, welcome back, or welcome still, if you've drifted somewhere between wakefulness and that warm, floaty pre-sleep haze. Tonight, we're gliding through royal bedrooms and wedding halls, where the candlelight was soft, but the politics were sharp. These are the unions that were supposed to bring peace and prosperity, yet instead delivered resentment, betrayal, and occasionally, actual wars. Because nothing says romance like a dowry dispute or a politically convenient beheading. Henry VIII and his 6 marriages, the original reality show. We can't talk about disastrous royal marriages without mentioning Henry VIII, the man who treated matrimony like a revolving door with a high mortality rate. He started young and handsome, full of optimism and musical talent. He married Catherine of Aragon, his late brother's widow, and for a while, things looked promising. She was devoted, pious, and intelligent. But after years of miscarriages and only one surviving child, a daughter, Henry grew restless. He needed a son. Or rather, he believed England needed one. Enter Anne Boleyn, charming, ambitious, and entirely unwilling to be a royal mistress. Henry's obsession with her led him to break with the Catholic Church, triggering the English Reformation. For love, or something resembling it, he changed the religion of an entire country. And then, when it also failed to produce a male heir, he had her executed on charges of adultery and witchcraft. Because of course he did. By the time Henry was done, he'd gone through 6 wives, 2 divorces, 2 executions, 1 annulment, and 1 widowhood. It was less a love life and more a cautionary political thriller. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, a match made in awkward silence. Let's drift to France, where Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI married to seal an alliance between Austria and France. She was 14. He was 15. And both were painfully shy. Their marriage was famously unconsummated. For 7 years. The European rumor mill went wild, producing pamphlets that mocked their supposed incompatibility. Eventually, things improved, slightly, but by then, it was too late. The French people resented her extravagance, his indecision, and the sheer sense of detachment from reality that hung over Versailles. They didn't hate each other exactly. They just never really connected. 2 kind souls trapped in a collapsing world, both too soft for the revolution that was coming. When they finally met the guillotine, months apart, it felt almost inevitable. Their marriage began as a treaty and ended as a tragedy. George IV and Caroline of Brunswick, a royal soap opera. Across the channel, George IV of Britain entered his own marital farce. He was already secretly married to a Catholic widow, which was illegal for a royal, but that didn't stop him from agreeing to wed Caroline of Brunswick, sight unseen, for a tidy financial settlement. When they finally met, George reportedly staggered back and called for brandy. Caroline was loud, eccentric, and defiantly unimpressed by her new husband. They separated almost immediately after their daughter's birth. Years later, when George became king, he tried to have Caroline banned from his coronation. She showed up anyway, pounding on the palace doors until guards physically removed her. It was less fairy tale wedding and more public scandal with costumes. Philip II of Spain and Mary I of England, a cold alliance. Before Elizabeth I's long reign, her sister Mary Tudor, known to history as Bloody Mary, tried her own hand at marital diplomacy. She married Philip II of Spain, hoping to strengthen Catholic ties and restore England to Rome. Philip, unfortunately, had all the warmth of a damp cathedral. He barely spoke English and had little interest in his new wife. The English people despised him, fearing foreign domination. Mary adored him. He tolerated her. She had 2 phantom pregnancies, heartbreaking false hopes that turned out to be either tumors or hormonal imbalances. When she died, lonely and childless, Philip was reportedly busy elsewhere. The alliance she'd sacrificed so much for dissolved almost immediately. It's one of the quieter tragedies of royal history, love unreturned, and duty unrewarded. Empress Alexandria and Nicholas II, love amidst the end of an empire. Now we drift into Russia again. Nicholas II and Alexandra Fyodorovna were genuinely in love, a rarity among royals. But even true affection can't withstand the weight of empire. They married in 1894, soon after Nicholas became Tsar. He was gentle but indecisive. She was devout, anxious, and deeply unpopular. Their son, Alexei, was born with hemophilia, a secret that haunted them. In desperation, Alexandra turned to mystics and healers, including the infamous Grigory Rasputin, whose influence over the royal family became a scandal across Russia. The public saw her as a foreign witch, her husband as weak, and their love as part of the empire's decay. When revolution came, they faced it together, even to the end. It was devotion, but devotion that couldn't save them. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, the one that worked, until it didn't. Not every royal union was miserable. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were, by all accounts, genuinely in love. He balanced her fiery temper with calm intellect. Together, they became the symbol of stable domestic life. But their happiness was so intense that it became unsustainable. When Albert died at only 42, Victoria plunged into 40 years of mourning. She wore black for the rest of her life. She slept beside his clothes, preserved his shaving water each morning, and kept his rooms exactly as he'd left them. It's touching, and also, in a quiet way, deeply sad. Her grief became her identity. Even love, in royal history, could be suffocating. Catherine the Great and Peter III, the royal mismatch. Then there's the Russian Empress Catherine the Great, a woman who married badly, then built an empire anyway. She wed Peter III, a German prince more interested in toy soldiers than politics, or his wife. He would make his servants dress as Prussians and play mock battles in the palace courtyard. Catherine, meanwhile, was reading Enlightenment philosophers and quietly plotting how to take control. When Peter became Tsar, his incompetence alarmed everyone. Within months, Catherine led a bloodless coup and had him arrested. Shortly afterward, he died under mysterious circumstances. Catherine ruled alone for over 30 years, intelligent, pragmatic, and formidable. Sometimes, the worst marriages make the strongest monarchs. Ferdinand and Isabella, united in power, divided in policy. Now, let's visit Spain again. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile were history's ultimate power couple, jointly ruling what became modern Spain. They sponsored Columbus, reformed government, and unified their kingdoms. But beneath the partnership was constant rivalry. Each wanted to outshine the other. Their marriage was one of shared ambition, not warmth. Together they launched the Spanish Inquisition, a grim legacy born from paranoia and zealotry. So yes, they built an empire. But they also built one of Europe's darkest institutions. A marriage bound by politics, shadowed by intolerance. Napoleon and Josephine, love, lost and calculated. Few royal romances were as dramatic as Napoleon Bonaparte and Josephine de Beauharnais. They married in a whirlwind of passion, she, an older widow, he, an ambitious young general. He adored her. She cheated on him. Even after becoming emperor, he forgave her again and again, until she failed to produce an heir. He divorced her, weeping openly at the ceremony. She kept his letters, his portraits, and, reportedly, his heart in a locket. He married again, for politics. But when he died years later on St. Helena, his last whispered word was still her name. Charles II of England and Catherine of Braganza, a gentle failure. And finally, a softer story. Charles II, the merry monarch, loved wine, parties, and mistresses. His Portuguese wife, Catherine of Braganza, was pious and mild. She arrived in England with a dowry that included Bombay and Tangier, so politically, the match was useful. But personally, not so much. She never bore him a child, and he was never faithful. Yet he treated her with unusual kindness, protecting her from court gossip and even defending her against false accusations of treason. In the end, they found a quiet companionship. Not love, perhaps, but a kind of peace. And in royal history, that's a rare and precious thing. Reflections, love, power, and the weight of the crown. Royal marriages were never simple. They were chess moves disguised as romance. Alliances wearing wedding rings. And yet, within that machinery of politics, there were moments of genuine tenderness. A glance. A letter. A whispered joke shared between monarchs who never chose each other, but tried to make it work anyway. Sometimes it ended in tragedy. Sometimes in indifference. Sometimes, miraculously, in love. Closing thoughts, drifting back to quiet. So as we fade from the candlelit corridors of palaces long turned to dust, let's leave the royals to their uneasy sleep. Henry and his ghosts of wives. Marie and Louis, still shy in some forgotten ballroom. Catherine and Peter, forever locked in their silent argument. And Victoria, holding on to her memories of Albert. Their crowns gleamed brightly, but their hearts were fragile things, weighted by duty, dulled by politics, and often cracked by love. Now, if your eyes are heavy, that's perfectly fine. History has a way of soothing us, even when it's full of absurdity. Because in the end, the past isn't so different from the present, just dressed in silk and powdered wigs. Thank you for drifting through tonight's stories with me. Until next time, sleep well, dream softly. And remember, even kings and queens were only human. Hey everyone. Welcome back. Or maybe, welcome in, if you're already halfway to sleep. Tonight, we're gliding through the medieval world of crusaders, those pious warriors who marched east to reclaim the Holy Land. They carried crosses on their tunics, swords in their hands, and a rather flexible understanding of sin in their hearts. Because, as we'll discover, medieval morality was not exactly black and white. It was beige, with bloodstains. And in between battles and blessings, there existed a fascinating contradiction, a deep obsession with purity, paired with an equally impressive enthusiasm for vice. Let's drift there now, into the smoky encampments of the First Crusade. The holy war that wasn't so holy. The First Crusade began in 1096, when Pope Urban II called on the faithful to take up arms and liberate Jerusalem. Thousands responded, knights, peasants, monks, widows, entire families. They marched east under the sign of the cross, and almost immediately began looting every settlement in their path. The Pope had promised that anyone who joined the crusade would have their sins forgiven. And naturally, many interpreted that as a sort of unlimited moral credit card. If the idea of fight for God and all your sins are erased sounds like a loophole, it was. Faith, fear, and flesh. Now, you might imagine crusaders as endlessly stoic, praying under the stars, speaking only of righteousness. In truth, many were exhausted, homesick, and perpetually hungry. And human nature finds ways to cope. Wherever crusader camps appeared, brothels soon followed. Sometimes run by local women. Sometimes by fellow crusaders' wives looking for extra income. Occasionally, by clergy. Yes. There are records of bishops regulating prostitution in crusader territories. In some cases, priests collected fees from brothel owners for moral supervision. Because of course they did. The church condemned fornication, of course. But it also understood supply and demand. One bishop wrote that it was better to sin quietly than to riot publicly. In other words, do what you must, just keep the noise down. Confession culture, a medieval anxiety machine. To balance all this, there was confession. And medieval confession culture was intense. Before battle, crusaders were required to confess every sin they could remember. Every lie. Every stolen loaf of bread. Every intrusive thought. Priests warned them that dying with an unconfessed sin meant eternal damnation, which made confession both cleansing and terrifying. Some soldiers confessed daily. Some confessed multiple times a day, just to be safe. One chronicler wrote that crusaders confessed after each skirmish, as blood dripped still from their swords. Imagine the psychological toll, killing, repenting, killing again, repenting again. It was spiritual whiplash. Jerusalem as a spiritual paradox. When the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem in 1099, they were half-starved, delirious, and convinced that God himself guided their every move. They stormed the city walls. They slaughtered nearly everyone inside, Muslims, Jews, even some Christians. Then, covered in blood, they marched barefoot to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to give thanks. One chronicler described the streets as flowing with blood up to the ankles, yet still called it a miracle. That's medieval morality in one image, carnage beside prayer. The church tries to keep up. As the Crusades continued, the church found itself constantly renegotiating what sin meant on the battlefield. Medieval royalty loved the idea of children. Especially heirs. But the experience of actually raising one? That was considerably less poetic. Royal children weren't really children in the way we think of them today. They were miniature dynastic investments. Tiny, crying symbols of political alliances. And from the moment they were born, or even conceived, their lives stopped belonging to them. They became property of the crown, the church, and the often volatile machinery of medieval inheritance. Let's start at the beginning. In a royal nursery that was equal parts gilded and grim. Birth, the most dangerous privilege. A royal birth was both a spectacle and a crisis. Because childbirth, in the Middle Ages, was one of the most dangerous things a woman could do, even for queens. The chambers were crowded with midwives, priests, and sometimes, horrifyingly, a small audience of courtiers, there to verify the legitimacy of the heir. Yes, it was a royal tradition in parts of Europe for witnesses to be present at the birth. Because nothing said welcome to the world like several strangers confirming you weren't a changeling or an inconvenient imposter. The mother's survival was far from guaranteed. Catherine of Aragon, first wife of Henry VIII, endured 6 pregnancies, only one child, Mary, lived beyond infancy. And Catherine herself was left exhausted, devout, and quietly broken. Meanwhile, in France, Queen Anne of Brittany gave birth 14 times. Only 2 children survived. Every royal nursery was a mix of silk and sorrow. Wet nurses, wards, and emotional outsourcing. Royal infants rarely met their parents in any meaningful sense. From the moment of birth, they were handed off to wet nurses, often peasants carefully selected for their moral reputation and milk supply. These women became the true mothers of royal babies. Actual queens were expected to move on, to recover, conceive again, and perform the exhausting cycle of fertility politics. Royal fathers, on the other hand, tended to regard their children the way one might regard a fine horse. They admired their health, expected obedience, and ignored them unless something went wrong. One chronicler wrote of Henry II of England that he loved his sons much, until they became men, and then he hated them. Which, honestly, sounds like every medieval family reunion ever. The education of a royal, a curriculum of misery. From toddlerhood, royal children were put under the care of tutors and clerics. They learned Latin before they learned empathy. They were taught to ride, pray, flatter bishops, and suppress visible emotion. The idea was to craft miniature adults, perfectly pious, terrifyingly poised. But under that polish, many were lonely. Consider Charles VI of France. Crowned as a child, doted on by courtiers, he grew up in a haze of luxury and superstition. By his 20s, he was violently paranoid, convinced his body was made of glass. He wore reinforced clothing so he wouldn't shatter. His courtiers humored him, because what else could they do? Telling a medieval king he was not made of glass was a fast track to unemployment, or worse. Little kings and the weight of crowns. Child kings were common, which is another way of saying political disasters were common. Take Henry VI of England. He became king at just 9 months old. Imagine being an infant and technically responsible for a nation you couldn't yet crawl across. By the time Henry was old enough to rule, he was deeply religious, painfully shy, and, as one historian put it, entirely unsuited to kingship. He loved prayer more than politics. And while England burned through the Wars of the Roses, Henry mostly fasted and prayed for everyone to get along. It didn't work. He was eventually deposed, imprisoned, and possibly murdered. A lifelong casualty of expectations he never chose. The inbred heirs of Habsburg Europe. And then, there were the genetics. Royal families, obsessed with keeping bloodlines pure, effectively turned Europe into a very slow-motion science experiment in why you shouldn't marry your cousin. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Habsburg dynasty. By the 16th century, they controlled most of Europe, Spain, Austria, parts of Italy, and the Low Countries. And they kept all that power in the family. Quite literally. After generations of intermarriage, the Habsburgs began to show unmistakable physical signs of inbreeding, elongated jaws, drooping lips, and chronic medical issues. Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, was the tragic finale. He could barely chew food. He was described as more like a ghost than a man. He had the blood of so many royal ancestors that his family tree resembled more of a wreath. He died childless, and with him ended 200 years of royal genetic recycling. Spain, exhausted and leaderless, promptly fell into chaos. Princesses as political exports. While princes were pressured to inherit, princesses were currency. Their marriages brokered peace treaties, trade deals, or just temporary truces between families who would go back to hating each other next season. At the age of 4, some princesses were already promised to men decades older than them. Catherine de' Medici was married off at 14. Mary, Queen of Scots, at 15. Their lives were essentially diplomatic parcels with petticoats. One of the more haunting examples was Margaret of Austria, who was engaged and unengaged multiple times before she turned 13. By adulthood, she referred to herself bitterly as the pawn of Europe. And she was right. Loneliness in velvet. Royal childhood looked gilded, but it often sounded hollow. Music, tutors, jewels, and silence. Imagine growing up in a castle so vast you could walk for an hour and never see your parents. Every meal observed by servants. Every word monitored by tutors. Every friend chosen for you. The chronicler Philippe de Comines once wrote that princes know everything but love. And it shows. Many royal adults carried that emotional stunting for life. Henry VIII, for instance, was raised almost entirely apart from his parents. He grew up charming, talented, and incapable of stable affection. Which might help explain the 6 wives. Spoiled and starved. Ironically, some royal children were spoiled to the point of ruin and still deeply neglected. Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, grew up in such theatrical splendor that his meals were watched by hundreds of courtiers. They called it the Grand Couvert, a kind of sacred breakfast performance. And yet, he was also haunted by fear and isolation. He once said, "There is no joy in being feared." Though, to be fair, he did very little to change that dynamic. His son, the Grand Dauphin, inherited that loneliness and responded by throwing increasingly ridiculous parties to feel alive. One of his favorite activities was releasing live animals into banquet halls during feasts. You know. For morale. Sickly and doomed. Royal doctors, too, were part of the tragedy. Medicine was still an art form based largely on guesswork and leeches. Young heirs were frequently subjected to remedies that did more harm than good. Bleeding, purging, mercury treatments, and poultices made from ground pearls. Because if you were going to die, at least die expensively. King Edward VI of England, son of Henry VIII, was given so many medical cures during his final illness that historians still debate which one killed him first. The weight of symbolism. Royal children were expected to embody the health and future of their nations. If they sneezed, entire courts panicked. If they smiled, it was used as propaganda. If they died, wars began. And yet, none of it protected them from the universal truth. That childhood, no matter how gilded, is fragile. For every surviving prince or princess, dozens of royal infants vanished into history with only a Latin epitaph to mark their brief existence. Taken too soon, the records say. But really, they were never allowed to be here at all, not as themselves. The human behind the crown. And perhaps that's what's most haunting about royal childhoods. They remind us that power doesn't protect against loneliness. If anything, it amplifies it. Every spoiled prince, every quiet princess in her jeweled cradle, they were raised to be symbols before they could be people. They belonged to the crown, not to themselves. And even centuries later, when we look at their portraits, rosy cheeks, gold-threaded gowns, there's something eerily hollow in their painted eyes. A kind of polite vacancy. As if they knew, even then, what was expected of them. And what would be taken in return. Let's let that drift for a moment. The sound of distant court music fading through stone halls. The echo of tutors' footsteps. The soft rustle of silk in sorrow. Because next, we'll be wandering into another fragile illusion, one that sparkled on the outside and festered underneath.